Good morning. If you're visiting with us, I hope that you've been greeted. Thank you for spending your weekend with us here at Burnside. If you have a Bible and would open that up to Acts chapter 28, we are nearly to the very end of our sermon series in the book of Acts. I had even told Becky Smith as she was preparing the songs that we were going to finish the book of Acts this Sunday. Well, as I quickly dove into these verses, I realized, man, there was way too much here to cover. So I decided to break it into two sermons. So next week, Lord willing, we will end our sermon series in the book of Acts. We have been going verse by verse through the book of Acts, and where we last left off, we have been following the Apostle Paul and his ministry. And we last left Paul. He's aboard a prison ship, headed for Rome to stand trial for accused of crimes that he simply did not commit. And how did he get there? Well, it's through a long series of events and detailed events in Paul's life. But the one thing you need to understand is that it's all part of God's plan to witness to people in Rome. And we're going to talk about that here this morning. But if you remember, Paul was aboard this prison ship headed for Rome, and they ran into a ferocious storm when they left Fair Havens to try to get to Rome. And they were blown off course, and this ferocious storm lasted 2 weeks. And it was so bad that the crew were tossing over all the equipment needed to operate and to run the ship. And you know it's pretty bad when the crew is trying to abandon ship, right? And that's exactly what was happening. But what eventually ends up happening to Paul on this ship is that it ends up running aground just off of the shore of a tiny island called Malta. And everybody, 276 persons all in total, had to abandon ship and swim for shore. And all 276 people eventually make it safely to the island of Malta. The title of this morning's sermon is this. I think you're going to clearly see this. Life is hard, but God is faithful. I found this quote online and I really like it. It reads, "Life has a way of testing your faith, either by having nothing happen at all, or by having everything happen all at once." Man, that is 100% absolutely true. Your faith in God is tested when one of two things happens. Either you're waiting on God and you're waiting for Him to respond with an answer or to act or to move on something that you've been stuck on for a while and there's no answer. There's silence. You feel very alone in that. That is a testing of your faith when either nothing happens at all, or the second way that your faith is tested is by having everything happen at once. You ever have a month like that where you can't catch a break? The car breaks down, the refrigerator goes out, you're struggling with relationships, work is going terrible. Your faith is tested when either nothing happens at all or when everything seems to happen all at once. This morning, as we come to Acts chapter 28, Paul has now been a Christ follower for 29 years. And the one thing that I want you to walk away with from today's sermon is this. It is true. Life is hard. God is faithful. And so is Paul. And that's the lesson we're going to learn from his life. So let's first explore this detail. How about this? Life is hard. I don't think that is a new piece of information to you this morning. I don't think anyone who's lived a few years showed up here this morning and is thinking, oh, now I get it. Life is hard. Thank you for telling me that. I mean, in our culture today, we have a certain way of describing life when things goes from bad to worse. Finish these statements. When it rains, it out of the frying pan and into the... I'm waiting for the other shoe to... Right? We know what it's like when life takes an unexpected turn and it seems as though we can't catch a break. We know what it's like when life goes from bad to worse. We understand life is hard. And on the surface here this morning, as we're reviewing the Apostle Paul's life, I think it would be safe to assume that Paul is feeling very much the same way that a lot of us sometimes feel. Take note of this morning. Life is hard, even for the Apostle Paul. Because before we ever get into our text this morning in Acts chapter 28, we can surmise, we can assume, based on what we've studied from the life of Paul so far, that life for him was stressful at best. And at worst, it was devastating. We've covered this list a little bit before in our studies here in Acts, but it's worth repeating. Listen to the list that Paul himself compiled in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 21 through 28. He's writing this letter to the Corinthian Christians, and he says this. He says, look, I've been beaten 5 times with 39 lashes by the Jews. 3 times I was beaten with rods. 3 times I've been shipwrecked. I've been stoned to death. I've been in constant danger. I've had toil and hardship. I've had many sleepless nights. I've known what it's like to be hungry and thirsty. I've been exposed to the elements. And I have a daily anxiety for all the churches that I've planted. What I think is interesting about these verses is that Paul had a list. He was keeping track. He understood better than you and I understand that life is hard. If we were to take any one of those things listed in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, if you've been beaten with 39 lashes 5 times, just that in and of itself, I think we would agree with Paul. Man, life's hard. Life's unfair. You don't deserve it. Paul didn't enjoy any of the things that he experienced in his life when it came to tragedies and trials. It wasn't like he was some sort of sicko who was looking forward to pain. He didn't enjoy any of that. Life was simply hard even for Paul. And at the time that he wrote 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he had only been following Christ for 25 years up to that point. How long have you been a Christian? And what difficulties have you experienced during that time frame? How old were you when you realized that life was unfair and that life is hard? As a preacher, I get a first-hand look at just how difficult life has been for so many of you. Will you just humor me this morning? I want to see how many of life's challenges we've lived through together with. So if you would please raise your hand if I've ever been to come see you or a family member of yours in the hospital. Just raise your hand. Keep them raised so everybody can see. Tough, right? You think you put your hands down. Being in the hospital, nobody would choose that. Nobody wants to experience that. It's not a fun place to be. Raise your hand if you would please if I have performed the funeral of a family member or a loved one since I've been here. Raise your hand. Life is hard. Thank you. It hurts. And the valley of the shadow of death and disease, it can feel lonely, it can feel difficult, it can be painful, especially when it seems especially when it seems God is very distant from us. And this sermon would be pretty bleak, it'd be pretty discouraging if we ended right here. Life is hard. Well, let's come to our time decision. But thankfully, this is not where the sermon ends. It doesn't end with life being hard or unfair. Because what you need to know and what you need to understand about Paul's life is this. Yes, it's true. Paul may have been stranded on the island of Malta, but he was not abandoned. And that describes Paul's situation to a T, and it describes your situation if you're a follower of Jesus Christ and you're experiencing a season of difficulty. You may be stranded, but you're not abandoned. You may not be where you want to be. You may not be where you're trying to get going, but it doesn't mean that God has just left you all on your own and that, well, good luck. His journey wasn't over yet. And God was going to make good on His promise to get him to Rome. And in these verses 1 through 10, we're going to soon see that there are two pieces of evidence, two ways that God demonstrated that Paul was not abandoned. He was just simply stranded. So let's begin reading our text this morning, Acts chapter 28. Let's start in verse 1. It reads, "When they had been brought safely through," I want to pause right there, and I want to encourage you, if you have your Bible open, please underline, please highlight, circle it, whatever you can do with those words. When they had been brought safely through. You may have been through a terrible storm. Your ship may have sunk. You might have been stranded on an unfamiliar island, but you're not abandoned. And that's because God is faithful. They have been brought safely through. You see, one major reason that life feels so heavy from time to time is because we feel like God has somehow forgotten us. God, I'm down here. Where are you at? We feel abandoned by God. Your circumstance or your situation has you feeling like you're all on your own. And here's the truth. You're not. And some Christians who go through difficulty in life are scratching their head and being like, well, I thought God was good. Where is He in this situation? Well, life is hard. And you may not see everything that you want to see from God in it, but it doesn't mean that God has left you to kind of flounder on your own. Here's the reality. And I'm going to say it twice. And I'm going to read it because I wrote it out very carefully. It's not that God has abandoned you. It's that your journey's not over. You may not be where you want to be right now in life, but it's all part of the journey that God has for you in order to get you to where He wants you to be. Can I say that again? It's not that God has abandoned you. It's that the journey's not over. And while you may not be where you want to be in life right now, it's all part of the journey that God has for you in order to get you to where He wants you to be. That's really important to cling to. Can I do a follow-up portion of the survey I took just a little bit ago? Would you please humor me and raise your hand if I've conducted the wedding of you or your family member? Raise them high so I can see them, so others can see them. That was a good day, was it not? A good day. God was with you in that moment. Would you also raise your hand this morning if I baptized you or your family member, or I was present with you when you were able to baptize your family member? Raise your hand. That's a good day. That's a good day. God was there in those moments. And if God was there in the good moments of your life, doesn't it seem to make sense that God would be there during the not so good moments of your life? I think we can become sometimes so overwhelmed with life's hardships that we forget the times when God was so good to us. He was so gracious to us. And He was with us in the good times, and He'll be with us in the bad times. All right, let's finish out our text. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us extraordinary kindness. For because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire, and they received us all. Remember, the whole reason that they had the shipwreck was because they were setting sail at the beginning of winter. Nobody sails in the Adriatic Sea during winter time. That's when storms hit. So they finally arrived. They're wet, they're cold, and the natives there are expressing such great hospitality. They're like, come over here, we'll get a fire going, we'll get you warm. Verse 3, but when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. The word translated viper is a common Greek term used to describe a very venomous snake. A poisonous snake, a deadly snake. Verse 4. When the natives saw the creature hanging from Paul's hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man's a murderer, and even though he's been saved from the shipwreck, the sea, Justice has not allowed him to live. How would you like that? Not only do you get bit by an extremely poisonous snake, but now everybody thinks that you deserved it. Verse 5. What does Paul do? Here's what he does. Sorry about that, I had to. He does his best Taylor Swift move. The snake is hanging from his hand. He's like, oh, there's a snake. Shakes it off, drops in the fire, right? That's what he does. He shakes it off. He's like, yeah, boy, that was unfortunate. He doesn't dwell on it. He's not like, woe is me. He just simply says, yeah, that's a snake. Shakes it off and continues on, right? Look at verse 6. But then when the natives saw this, they were expecting that Paul was going to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he's a god. Can you imagine, just for a moment, having an accident and going to the ER and the medical staff coming in like, yeah, we can't do anything for you. We just want to see what's going to happen to you. Can you imagine that? And these natives were just hanging around waiting for Paul to drop dead or to swell up like a balloon. But these natives were going to be sorely disappointed. Why? Because Paul is absolutely 100% fine. And it's a miracle. And notice how quickly the natives change their mind about Paul. They go from, oh, he's a criminal, he deserves to die, to, oh, he must be a god. There's a lesson to be learned in that as well. That's how fickle the world can be concerning Christians. They will love you one minute, and then they will try to cancel you the next. Be careful trying to please the world. So I told you that in these verses, there are two pieces of evidence that God gives to us to show us that we are not abandoned, that God is faithful. Here's the first piece of evidence that God shows to Paul. Look, I'm with you. I haven't forgotten you. And it's the same piece of evidence that you and I can have in our lives as well. Here it is. Are you ready? The first piece of evidence that God was with Paul, not abandoning Paul, is that God is keeping His promise to Paul. Do you remember the promise that God made to Paul? It was back in Acts chapter 23, verse 11. As Paul was being held captive in I believe, Caesarean jail, he's like, man, what am I doing here, God? Am I going to die here in this prison cell? God's like, no, you have to be my witness in Rome. I'm going to get you to Rome, Paul. You're going to be in Rome and you're going to declare to the people there about my son Jesus Christ. That was God's promise, and He was making good on His promise. He wasn't going to go to all the trouble of getting Paul this close to Rome and then have some stupid snake kill him. Now here's the deal. Did you notice that God promised to bring Paul to Rome? But what He didn't promise Paul, He didn't say, it's going to be an easy journey for you. We're going to get you to Rome and you're going to have first-class accommodations, and when you get there, you're going to be welcomed. That was never part of the promise. The promise was just simply, you're going to get to Rome and you're going to preach in Rome. Well, Paul is going to Rome, but he's a prisoner, suffering a shipwreck, getting bit by a snake. It was not an easy or enjoyable journey for Paul. And maybe you're here today, and life is hard for you. And sometimes we look at the pain in our life and we focus on everything that we've lost and how bad it hurts. And we forget that God has been good to us, even in those moments. And I'm not trying to somehow downplay the tragedies in your life. Of course it hurts. Of course it's painful. Of course it's okay to mourn and to grieve the things that we've lost. But also think about how God has blessed us along the way. Think about how God has rescued us along the way. Think about how God has loved you along the way. And yes, it's true, the snake still bit Paul, but that wasn't God's fault. That's simply the broken world in which we live. Ships sink. Snakes bite. But God is keeping His promise to get Paul to where He told him he was going to go, to Rome. God is doing His part. And for you and for me, cars crash, houses burn, children get sick, people get cancer, spouses die. And it's not God's fault. It's just part of the broken world in which we live. But God is faithful to keep His promise to get you to where He told you you're going to go. And the place that He's promised you and me, if we live faithful lives following after Jesus, He's promised us that we will get to heaven. And God is doing His part. He's keeping His promise. But the problem is, sometimes we mistake God made a promise with trouble-free. And that's not at all what God has promised. He's not promised us a life of first-class accommodations. We've been told, we know what we're getting into. Life is hard. It's filled with difficulties. The world is going to hate you because of me. In this world you will have many troubles. But hear me, God is faithful. And God's faithfulness is proven through the fact that He keeps His promise. He did it for Paul, and He's doing it for you. That shows that God is with you. Now what's cool is that this snake bite thing that happens to Paul in Acts chapter 28 verse 3 is really a fulfillment of what Jesus Christ says was going to happen. In Mark chapter 16, Jesus is giving the Great Commission to His disciples. He's getting ready to ascend back into heaven. He's got his apostles gathered around Him. And He says this to those men who were there, "These signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will pick up serpents, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." This is a promise to the apostles of Jesus Christ. And isn't it cool that the things that are happening to Paul are happening exactly the way that Jesus said they were going to happen? Now, here's the thing. Those promises were for the apostles. And there's no apostles living today. So don't go home and think you're going to drink a glass full of bleach. And don't go home and try to, pick up the king cobra, all right? That's not a promise for you and me. It's a promise that was made to the apostles, and Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ. And what I love is that it was evidence that while Paul was stranded on the island of Malta, he was not abandoned because God was keeping His promise. No stupid snake is going to keep you from getting to Rome, Paul. I made a promise to you, and I'm going to make good on that promise, Paul. Let's look at verse 7. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed, afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. Isn't this amazing? I want to stop right here and talk just for a second about Publius. What I love about the story of Publius, he was so hospitable to the Apostle Paul and presumably to Luke and to Aristarchus, who were with Paul. And Publius had problems of his own. So for 3 days, he welcomes Paul into his home. He feeds him, he takes care of him, he treats him as a guest. And as they're there, I'm sure there was a back room or something, and Paul is looking back there and he's like, "Who's that laying in bed back there?" And Publius is like, "Oh, that's my dad. He's really sick. We're not sure what's going on. He had a fever that was persistent, and he had dysentery." That is the Bible's politically correct way of saying he had chronic diarrhea. All right? Now here's the thing about that in that day. The way that you got dysentery was probably because you ate some contaminated food or you drank some contaminated water. And they didn't have antibiotics, and he's running a fever, so clearly he's got an infection. And so they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have Pepto-Bismol, Imodium AD, they didn't have anything to help with the symptoms. And it could very well be that if you had suffered this, that was your death sentence. You're going to die. And Publius is not only so gracious to take care of these guests, he's been faithfully looking after his dad, who's been sick. For how long? We don't know. And in the midst of that, even though he had his own problems, Publius was still serving and showing love to people in his community. Can I just say, we need some more Publiuses in the church today. So many of us, right? If we've got something going on in our life, we're like, sorry, I can't serve. I've got this going on. Love to help you. Be warm, be well fed, you're on your own, right? Not Publius. He's like, hey, I'll help, I'll serve, what do you need me? I love that about this. So Paul goes in and he heals his dad. Does this tremendous healing that takes place. Well, guess what? Word gets out. Verse 9. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to Paul and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all that we needed. Well, here's the second piece of evidence that shows, that proves that God has not abandoned Paul, that God was with him the whole time. And it's the same piece of evidence that God would use to declare to you that, look, I'm with you. I know life is hard, but I'm with you. And that is this: God ensured that Paul was having a fruitful ministry. And you're like, how does that prove that God's with me? Hang with me. You're going to see it in just a moment. Because even despite the circumstances and the difficulty of Paul's life, there was clear evidence that God was at work and that God was using Paul to accomplish some amazing, life-altering events in the lives of people. Paul was healing, and did you catch what it says there in verse 9? It said many were coming to him and not getting healed, but were being what? Cured. There's a difference between being healed and being cured. A healing signifies that maybe there was a miracle that was done. Being cured means that you took some medicine and you got well. Guess who's with the Apostle Paul in Publius' household? The guy who's writing the book of Acts, Dr. Luke. Could it be that Dr. Luke and the Apostle Paul were there working, healing, and bringing cures to those who were sick? And as a result, God was blessing Paul's ministry. And God was proving, I'm with you, Paul. I haven't gone anywhere. I'm right here with you, even on the island of Malta. Well, how is that evidence that God's with us? Well, here's how it's evidence that God's with us. Let me read 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 11. To give you some context, the church in Corinth was just a real big mess. And they were having disputes. And they were like, well, I'm better than you are because I'm a disciple of Paul. Oh yeah? Well, I'm better than you are because I'm a disciple of Apollos. And this is what Paul writes to these Christians who were fighting with each other. He says, what then is Apollos? And what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave us opportunity. I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. Who causes the growth? God. It's highlighted for you in yellow in case you missed it. Who's causing the growth? God is causing the growth. So guess what? A fruitful ministry is evidence that God has not abandoned you or left you all on your own. It's evidence that God is right there doing what He said He would do for you. God causes the growth. Now, lest we just get content here at Burnside Christian Church, like, well, God's going to cause growth. We can't do anything about it. Did you notice? It doesn't mean that you stop watering or that you stop planting. You better be out planting and you better be out watering. What this is saying is you do those two things and God's going to bless your ministry with some growth. But God causes the growth. And God was with Paul even on the island of Malta as he was ministering and healing and serving. Now here's the problem. So many times when tragedy hits, when we're dealing with things that are not fun, when life is painful and hard, here's what usually happens. We quit our ministry. We quit serving. We quit working. We quit giving. We quit our ministry. And because we quit our ministry, we never see evidence that God would cause any growth in our ministry. And so the word of counsel I would have for you today, if life is hard for you, don't quit. Don't quit your ministry. You'll never see the evidence that God is with you all along. Yes, life is hard. But if you quit, you're never going to see how faithful God can be. Life is hard. God is faithful. Do you see this demonstrated in the life of Paul? You need to understand that life will be hard for you too, and it doesn't mean that God has left you on your own simply to deal or face it on your own. It means that if you will look for God in the midst of your difficulty, you will find God's faithfulness. If you look for God in the midst of your situation, you will find and you will see that God has been faithful. And so as we close out our time together, I want to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. I wonder if, as Paul was experiencing shipwreck and imprisonment and snake bites, I wonder if he was quoting these verses. He's like, I remember I wrote that letter to the Corinthians. Listen to what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not of ourselves. We are afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed. We don't know why this is happening, but we're not despairing. We haven't lost hope. We're persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. For we who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. Here's the situation. Life is hard. It's unfair. It was for Paul. But even though Paul was stranded, he was not abandoned. And I would dare say that in your situation, even though life is hard, life is unfair, you too are not stranded. You're simply stranded, not abandoned. This morning our decision song is going to be "Open My Eyes That I May See." How perfect of a song is that? I think in the midst of difficulty in life, you need to make this song your prayer. God, open my eyes so that I can see your faithfulness, so that I can feel your presence. I want to see that you're with me, that I'm not abandoned. I'm just simply stranded. Let's stand together and let's pray, and then we're going to have our time of decision.